Hi, Brenden. Thanks for coming on to talk to us.
Of course, my pleasure to be here. You too. Thanks for having me.
That's all right. So, what led you to creating your channel, MasterTalk?
Yeah, of course. So what happened basically was when I was in university, I used to do these things called case competitions. So think of it
Right.
like professional sports, but for nerds. So other guys my age were playing footy or rugby or cricket or something. I was using the same competitive spirit and I was applying it to presentations. So I probably presented what 500 times when I was in university, coached dozens of people on public speaking. So when I started working in corporate Canada, I guess, in the corporate world, kind of just asked myself, what should I do with my life now? How can I add value to other people? And I noticed that a lot of the YouTube content on public speaking was really terrible. So I started making YouTube videos on the topic in my basement. I thought it was a stupid idea. One thing led to another, and here we are today.
Right. Right.
Have,
So, go on,
sorry,
Jack.
yeah. Have you always had a passion for public speaking? Has it always been something that's interested you? Because it's obviously something to apply that competitiveness that you had that other people would apply to sports and apply it to presentations is quite niche. It's not necessarily something that everybody would think of doing. So have you always had that? Where did that come from?
Right, and it's a great question. I actually hated public speaking for most of my life.
Right.
And the reason is because when I was 5 years old, because I grew up in a city called Montreal. Not many people know this, but Montreal is a city where very few people in the city only speak one language. So most people are either bilingual or trilingual.
Right.
So growing up in Montreal, my parents looked at me and they said, well, Brenda, you don't know French, so you need to study French. So they threw me into a French education system, which of course ended up being very beneficial for me because now I speak more than one language. But at the time, it sucked because not only was I uncomfortable with presentations, I had to present in a language I didn't even know.
Sure.
So
What age was this?
this was I started I started kindergarten when I was 5, so it was like
Right.
right at the beginning. So I
Right.
guess from the ages of 5 to 16, I was essentially presenting in a language I just didn't know, which was
Yeah.
very tricky. So I would say for the first 3 or 4 years of that journey, I guess between the ages of maybe 5 and 9, I just had trouble communicating with other students, just figuring out how to speak French. So essentially the fears that most people have in public speaking were amplified in my case. So public speaking and yet alone being a YouTuber was the last thing on my mind until I went to university and fell in love with doing it competitively.
Right. I'm curious because I was watching a few of your videos earlier, and I think you kind of hinted at it. But would you describe yourself as an extrovert or an introvert?
Right, I would definitely lean more an extrovert. I'm definitely
Right.
someone who likes to be around people. But a lot of the people I've coached that are much better than I am as a speaker are a lot more introverted. They're a
Right.
lot less polarizing as speakers. They're very strong as well. So I hate that whole extrovert introvert speaking thing. I think anyone
Yeah.
can be a great speaker. You just got to figure out what you're good at and figure out what those weaknesses are and work on them.
Yeah, I agree. I would describe myself as quite an introverted person, but like you said, I don't think it's impossible to learn those skills or to master them. Um, so I was watching your videos earlier and found them very sort of very informational, but I found that I could relate to them in quite a good way because recently I've been trying myself to sort of improve my speaking, my public speaking, specifically in relation to this podcast because I feel like you probably get quite critical of yourself when you hear yourself back quite a lot after recording
Very
these kind of
true.
things. Um, so, did you ever go through a time in your life where you sort of discovered the usefulness of good questions and did that sort of thing become more natural to you, or you said a minute ago that you felt like it was something you learned?
Yeah, definitely. I think the idea of asking great questions, mostly to yourself, stems from a curiosity on on this experience that we all have as humans. So I think for me, what happened was when I was young, I just started asking questions that most people tend not to ask. So things like, I don't know, why are we all saving up for retirement where most people a lot of people die in their 40s or 50s? It just didn't make sense to me. But what happened is and that one question led to 1,000 other ones. I just went under this rabbit hole. And then I started asking much more challenging questions like, what are you pretending not to know? If
Mm.
you had all the money in the world, how would you spend your time? Because at that point,
Yeah.
you don't need to work anymore. And the third question, which was not my favorite one, but I'll get to my favorite one. But another one that comes to mind is, this idea of if you died tomorrow, what would your funeral speech say about you? What would somebody say in that speech about who you were and the life that you lived? And the hardest question I've ever answered in my life is a question I got from this guy named Peter Thiel, who's the author of the book 0 to 1. He basically started a bunch of billion-dollar companies with a lot of people that you'd probably know, like the founders of YouTube, LinkedIn, and all that stuff. And the question he asks in the first page of his book is the following. What is the truth that you believe in that most people disagree with you on? So what's something that you think is right that most people think is wrong? And the challenging aspect of this question and why most people don't want to ask it to themselves or find an answer is because it forces that individual to answer something controversial. And the punchline... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just on that point about controversy, and I think a lot of this stuff is about... a lot of the things that you just mentioned are about looking inwards and sort of putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, much like happens with public speaking. Do you think that I don't know how old you are, but I'm 22. Brett, you're 24? 23.
4 in December.
And I think people of our age, maybe more and more, for whatever kind of reason, I think we can find it more and more difficult to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations and ask ourselves those kinds of uncomfortable questions. Is that something that you've seen? Do you think that that's a barrier that people have to face or people avoid, and does that hold people back, do you find?
I completely agree. And just for the record, so people know, I'm 24, so we're all the same age pretty much. But the way that I think about this is most people, it gets a bit more philosophical, but there's this guy named René Girard who's a philosopher, and he has this theory called mimetic theory. He basically argues that people, in general, even if they don't like to admit it, model their life against other people. So for example, let's say you're in the United States and you're a Democrat. The reason you're a Democrat is not really because you want to be, or because you understand all the policy. It's a political party in the States. You're probably aware, but just for the audience. But rather the question is, who did I grow up with? If everyone around me is a Democrat, I'm just going to be one. If everyone around me is a Republican, I'm just going to be one. But at the end of the day, there's not that much big difference between both of the policies and both of what they stand for. They both watch Netflix, they both hang out with their families, they both eat the same hamburgers. Like, it's not like a huge difference, in my opinion anyways. So the issue with most people is that they rely on other people to give them direction instead of finding their own truth. So why do I go to university? Well, my parents went to university, so I'm going to go to university. So what should I do with my life? Well, my parents told me to be a doctor. I should probably be a doctor because all my friends are going to med school. All that kind of stuff, right? Based on your surroundings. So I think that's what leads people astray, is that they run down a rabbit hole because our brain is wired for survival, not happiness, and then they realize that after they survive and they make it to the end, they kind of just go, this is not exactly what I wanted, but I don't know why.
For sure. Is this something that should be covered in education, do you think? Is that something that we should be taught from a young age to confront these things? And approach them honestly and openly, and be put in uncomfortable situations to be able to answer those questions more properly.
Oh yeah, we could have a whole conversation about all the 75,000 things that would change in the education system, but unfortunately for me, I don't have that much time on the planet to solve everything. So I think the way that I would think about this is through the following idea. Whenever you want to make a change in the world, always think about the easiest way of achieving that change. Because if you always think about the hardest way, you'll just give up and not do anything, right? So for me, what I chose to do was I noticed like a bunch of problems in the world, and I just said, okay, is there one problem that I can take ownership of? And the problem I chose was public speaking. So if I die and I don't democratize all the information, I'll leave it as my fault for not having gotten that done, right? But I'll leave it up to everyone else to solve every other problem, but this one problem I'll take ownership of. But if everyone did that, I think the world would just be a better place.
Yeah, most definitely. And if people try to approach solving those individual those individual problems, or finding an individual purpose, I think we'd get a lot further as well. You know, it's funny that you mentioned political parties, for example, but I think that one of the biggest issues with political parties, or just politics in general, is this idea of having to cover as many bases and as much ground as possible, and not focusing in on sort of the fundamentals of the building blocks of society. What problems, what root causes to problems can we work on solving, and how can we solve those to the best of our ability in the short amount of time that we've got to do that in a democratic society, whether it be here or in the States. And I think it's really fascinating that you've locked onto that one issue of improving people's public speaking. I assume you do that full time now.
No, actually, it's not my day job. I work as a technology consultant, but I won't be working there for much longer, I guess, based on how everything's going.
Sure, that's great. Go on, bro.
I was just gonna ask, what would you sort of a lot of the advice that you gave in your videos, and from what I'm getting from you this evening, it sort of seems to stem around, when it comes to public speaking, seems to stem around sort of throwing yourself in the deep end and sort of practicing and using these methods in a sort of trial and error manner. What would you might have covered it in some of your videos, because I haven't been through your entire category yet, because I did find them particularly interesting, so I will be going back. But what would you tell people who might be sort of struggling to get past the anxiety of throwing themselves into public speaking, or people who may have had embarrassing public speaking experiences that find them weighing on them?
Right. I think the first step is to find an idea that's worth sharing. I think that's where we should always start the conversation with. And the best way of thinking about that idea is to ask yourself the following question. The question is, how would the world change if you were an incredible speaker? If you were one of the best speakers in the world, how would the world change? And what you'll realize slowly as you reflect on this question, that public speaking and presentation is only a small component of what communication actually is. In reality, communication is everything. It's the tough conversations that you have with your family. It's the way that you talk to your partner. It's the way that you engage with your friends, the way that you do business negotiations or facilitate a conversation on a podcast. Every interaction you have is communication. So the first exercise I recommend people to do, especially those who are fearful of it, is to write down a very specific scenario of life in which you are a very good communicator. So for example, if you're 35 years old, you're married with 2 kids, and you always argue with your spouse or your husband, well then you could look at that and go, well, I just realized 70% of all of our fights has nothing to do with the arguments, but rather the fact that none of us understands each other. So if I get better at communication, those things won't happen again, and I'll fight 70% less. Or this idea of traveling to another country, not understanding the language, but for some reason understand the other person. Why is that? That's what communication is. And once you get clear on what that vision is for yourself, I think it's a lot easier to face the fear.
Right. Interesting. Would you... when it comes to actual public speaking settings, like doing a presentation in front of, a few dozen people, or doing videos or whatever online, which it seems to be more popular at the moment, considering the situation, you would just sort of say, dive in the deep end, practice these various techniques, but with an understanding of where you're good at, where your communication skills lie.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'll definitely add more layer to that. So I think the idea, so one easy tip that people can take away right away and implement tomorrow is what I call the puzzle method. Okay. So public speaking in many ways is like a jigsaw puzzle. You know those 1,000-piece puzzles that you do with your family at home or someplace? You got those jigsaws. So if I asked you to, which pieces would you start with first and why?
Corners and the outside. Set yourself a foundation and then move yourself in. Objects that are memorable in the scene. That's where I'd start.
Yeah.
Right.
Or
would you say something similar as well?
Yeah, basically, and look at colours, I suppose, constant colours.
Right. So focusing on this idea of starting with the corners, I agree with that. Right. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why don't we do that in public speaking? We have a university presentation, a school presentation, a work presentation in 2 days. So what do? We start with the middle pieces first. We shove a bunch of content in our presentations. And then we get to the presentation, we get to our last slide, and this is what happens. Yeah, so thanks. That's pretty much how we conclude 99% of our presentations. Whereas the trick to puzzle is to work through a presentation in exactly the same way as you'd walk through a jigsaw puzzle. Start with the edges first. Practice your introduction 50 to 100 times, not 5 times. Do it 50 times. So then when you look at your intro, you're like, wow, I'm pretty good at this thing. Do the same thing with the conclusion, because what's a great movie with a terrible ending? A terrible movie. So do the same thing 50 to 100 times. In 3 hours, you'll have changed your life, and now with the newfound confidence, you tackle the middle. And remember, much like jigsaw puzzles that are 1,000 pieces or more, it is daunting to do the puzzle alone. So find some people to practice with. Even today, as a professional speaker, I still have a bunch of people who help me with my keynotes. So if I'm doing that, I think everyone should be as well.
Yeah, I think working collaboratively is a really good piece of advice, and I think for most people, like I think Brett, you alluded to this, is that the main barrier is the fear of judgment, fear of messing up, and you kind of said to maybe merge both of these points, having the right kind of technique and practice and openness when facing these issues, but also understanding that we all mess up, we're all going to make mistakes, and the only way that you can improve on something is by practicing it and working at it and trying to gain some kind of expertise. And that's certainly, I think, what we've found with doing this podcast, or when I as part of the business that we run, Brenden, before COVID, delivering workshops to students who can often be the most brutal people to speak in front of, because they're the most honest. Young people tend to be the most honest. Is having that understanding that you're going to run into barriers, and you're going to face difficulties, but having the bravery to face those and overcome those, I think is really important when we're looking at creating any kind of content or doing any kind of presentation.
Absolutely.
This is kind of out of left field a little bit, but I was I was just interested in the answer of this question. Do you think that social media at all plays any part in swinging people's perception of public speaking, either to the side of being more scared of it and less likely to try and hone those skills, or is it does it promote it in some way? Does it, because everybody's sharing their opinions online? I mean, I know it's not as direct, so it's quite easy to just sort of shout something on Twitter and not have to confront anybody about it. But do you think that it means that our generation will be less likely to indulge in public speaking?
The way I see this, Brett, is that social media is a tool, and what you choose to do with the tool is what's going to determine the outcome. So if you take me as an example, one of the main reasons I got really good at communication, besides my amazing accountability group in university, was this idea that I just had access to all of the best speakers in the world for free. I go on YouTube, I watch all their TED Talks, I take notes, and I implement what they're doing. But if I didn't use social, because I count YouTube as social media, if I didn't have that as a tool, or if I used that same tool that everyone else has in a bad way, to send hate comments on Twitter, to waste my time watching dumb stuff, then yeah, of course it would completely destroy my ability to communicate in a thoughtful, fun way. So I think the key is not rather is this better or worse, but rather what you choose to do with it. And I think if you choose the right thing, it can be an amplifier. And if you choose to do the wrong thing, it becomes a detractor. And a good analogy I like to make is money. It's not that money is good or bad. Money is an amplifier of who you already are. If you were a good person, you're donating, 5% of your salary out of 50,000 before, and now you're worth 5 million. Well, you're still going to donate a lot of money. It's just going to be bigger quantities. But if you're a bad person before you had money, you'll just be a worser person after you have it. So it's the same thing with social media, I find.
Sure. Do you find yourself sort of judging celebrities or politicians in their public speaking techniques or habits, or even taking from them?
That's a super fascinating question. So no one's really asked me that. My point of view on this, and everyone's got their own, is you have to be very clear about who you want to help. So let's say in my case, my key demographic is somebody who has an idea worth sharing and wants to share it. An important idea, not like some stuff that isn't like adding value to people, but something that is actually meaningful. So the way that I think about this is, it doesn't need to be like a big podcast or anything. Like, let's say you're a 16-year-old girl at a high school and you want to raise $100 for charity. I think it's deplorable. I think it's crazy that she doesn't have access to free communication tools online, because most of the stuff out there is pure garbage.
Hmm.
So for me, I tend not to pay attention to those things. So for me, it's like, I know a lot of speech coaches in my industry like to do that for views. They kind of go, oh, how does Kim Kardashian communicate in this situation? Whereas I kind of look at this and I was like, who gives a shit? Like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's not helpful for people.
Mhm.
Don't get me wrong. There are some celebrities I look up to a lot, but it's a different kind of celebrity. So people
Sure.
like Gary Vaynerchuk, Seth Godin, Tony Robbins, Mel Robbins, like things like that. But they have ideas that are useful to people. But I think I'm very picky, I guess, of the people I follow. So I don't like politics because it divides really smart people into camps that are just unnecessary to be divided by.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. It's something interesting about the people that you just mentioned, Brendan. I don't know if this is maybe part of your teaching or what you think about this, is that they've all got a very individual and unique way of communicating. And something that I think sets them apart. There are probably fundamentals that they all use that can be taken, but take Gary Vee, for example. A very direct, but also very unique way of communicating and getting a point across. Is that something that you emphasise, is to in your public speaking, is to sort of reflect your own personality, not try and like a politician manufacture your speech too much, but try and be authentic?
Definitely, great point there, Jack. I think for me, that's definitely the approach I like to take, in the sense that the only thing that the best speakers in the world have in common is that they all have their own unique way of doing things. So you can't really copy them and expect to have the same success as them. It
Yeah.
doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But rather, my POV on this, like my point of view, is I think for 90% of people, like most people out there essentially, can get into the top 5 or 10% of all speakers in the world. But then if they want to transition to that last level, that version where they bring out their own personality, that takes a tremendous amount of guts, courage, and a strong belief system. That's something that's much harder to teach. So I think the way that I see the sequence of events is, you start as a normal speaker, and then you go, okay, let me master technicals, let me get better with my foundation. Then you get a bit more confident, you get into 10%. And then you say, okay, let's start and think about what ideas I want to share with the world. What is important to me? And then at some point, like if I use myself as an example, I used to speak just for competitions. I didn't have a unique idea to share. It was just something I liked to do. But then when MasterTalk came to be and I started the YouTube channel, I started to develop my own unique identity from an ideas perspective. And I said, oh, I have something very unique to share. Let me bring up more of my personality. Let me do more podcasts. Let me do that stuff. And now I'm slowly transitioning into the category where those giants are. So I think the idea is, you don't start there, but over time, as you focus on the foundational skills, eventually you end up become a master.
Mm. What's your ultimate goal if you looked at your future? Where do you want to take the YouTube channel that you're doing and all of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started, there wasn't really a mission. I started in my mother's basement. I just wanted to make videos for people who I was already coaching in university. I never wanted to make this a business or anything. I was just like, whatever. I mean, I'm going to be a senior executive at a company anyways. I don't really need to do these YouTube things. But I think what happened after a year, rather 7 months of doing this, is I kind of just looked at the world and said, hey, wait a second. The number one communication expert who ever lived, we have nothing to remember them by besides a book, and that person was Dale Carnegie, right? And I'm sure you guys know Dale's work. He's the author of the book How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Mm-hmm.
Sold tens of millions of copies, but the unfortunate reality of his story is we don't have a Dale Carnegie podcast. We don't have a Dale Carnegie YouTube channel, because that technology didn't exist in his day. And I have this weird, bizarre, unique opportunity that I just happened to be born at the right place at the right time with the right technology at the right age, where I joined that program that started 15 years before I started at the university. Everything kind of lined up, and the chips kind of all lined up in the right spot. So now the question is, what do I do with it? And I ended up realizing that I can be that person for people, so that when I'm dead, people can learn from me forever.
Nice. Well, it's an optimistic goal, and I love that. I think you're doing a really great job with the work that you're doing and your videos, even the ones that we've spent time watching in preparation for you coming on the podcast have really made us think about our public speaking and how we communicate using our podcast. And I think if you can,
Definitely.
even in a small time frame in a few videos, make people think profoundly as to how they're communicating, you're well on your way. So yeah, Brett, did you have any more questions?
No, basically that was it. Yeah. Thanks very much for coming on, Brenden.
Of course, thanks for having me, you too.
Really appreciate
and,
it. Was there anything you wanted to plug?
Oh yeah, sure. If you guys want to check out the YouTube channel, it's MasterTalk in one word. And I always like to give a book recommendation too.
Sure,
You
yeah,
guys-
absolutely.
Yeah, please do.
If you guys want a public speaking book recommend, my favorite one of all time is a book called Thirst by Scott Harrison. So Scott's a really smart guy. He's the CEO of Charity Water. I think the way that he thinks about branding, marketing, and storytelling is very applicable in a lot of the ideas you have to share, because Scott didn't have that much money. He started a non-profit, but he was able to efficiently use the money he had and the resources he had to build a really powerful brand. He probably speaks like 100 to 150 times a year to
Wow.
promote Charity Water. So I think he's a really smart guy, and I recommend the read.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to look into that. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.